Hello YouTube. Today I will talk about very unusual experiments that took place almost 100 years ago in the Soviet Union. And unfortunately this is a very modern issue. A chimera, the fabulous Greek mythological creature which had a lion's head, a goat's body and a serpent's tail, has come to mean any hybrid of the two or more creatures, and is a term used in genetics. Chimpanzees are believed to be many scientists to be the closest relatives of humans. The genetic difference between the two species is estimated to be 1.7% at the DNA level. Now that's less than between horses and zebras. Recent progress in studies of the DNA sequences, the fossil record, and brain functions support the idea that there is a sizable gap separating chimpanzees and monkeys, but not chimpanzees and humans. So many years ago, there was a famous scientist, according to the somewhat recently declassified Soviet documents, who wanted to close the gap between the Homo sapiens and punk troglodytes. His name was Ilya Ivanovich Ivanov. Now, I've read about this Russian and later Soviet scientist before, but my knowledge of his work was no greater than what is known about him in the West at the time. He was born in 1870. In 1898, Ivanov established in Moscow several zoological laboratories, where he had studied the reproduction, structure, and vital processes of sex organs of farm animals. In 1901, he established the world's first Center for Artificially Impregnated Horses. Before and after the Communist Bolshevik Revolution, or takeover of the government of Russia, Ivanov applied his practical technique to other domesticated species. Several million cattle and sheep were artificially inseminated by the mid-1930s. You see, the Soviets needed strong animals for their monumental transformation of the economy. He also tried to preserve some endangered species using artificial insemination. Not long before his death, Professor Ivanov was released from a Soviet concentration camp. Apparently he became a zek, or prisoner in Soviet slang, but not because of his political views or heresy. No, Professor Ivanov failed to successfully carry out sinister scientific experiments in the area of human artificial insemination. Rumors had it that in 1926 he carried out hybrid experiments in which he tried to artificially inseminate human and ape females with other species sperm. In 1927, a Russian émigré newspaper, Russkое Время, published articles about Professor Ivanov's chilling experiments. But who would really believe an émigré newspaper? Many in the West at the time were supporting the progressive, so to say, Soviet Republic and closed their eyes on what was going on in the USSR. But the proof came about such experiments after the fall of the Soviet Union, according to Alexander Potapov, who published his research back in 2004 in Russia. And a document was discovered in the state archives of the Russian Federation. This unique document, and I have all the information for everybody who needs it, was the authorization of a special commission created in 1929 by the Sovnarkom, the administrative arm of the Soviet government at the time. Now, the document stated that the commission agreed with the authorization of the Physics-Mathematical Department of the All Soviet Academy of Sciences, dated September 30, 1925. Professor Ivanov's proposed anthropoid interspecies hybridization experiments were considered to be of great scientific importance. His experiments were to be continued in the Sukhumi monkey colony, which was a Soviet primate center. The hybridization experiments, or the artificial insemination of human females by anthropoid sperm, could be conducted only with the written agreement of the female. She would accept the risk and obey the required strict isolation regime. The experiments were to be conducted with all necessary safeguards, including preclusion of natural insemination. And the experiments were to be conducted on as many human females as possible, but in no case fewer than 5. Who could be interested in the experiments? Why would the luminaries of Soviet science laud the uncanny research of Professor Ivanov? According to Potapov, the Bolshevik elite wanted to destroy the belief in God and subject nature to serve the new Soviet man. Listen, as a former Soviet citizen, I can add that neither general ethical concerns nor the Judeo-Christian beliefs would be of any interest to Soviet government. Stalin, whose bloody star was riding in the crimson world of Soviet politics, would get hybrid slaves who would inhabit special areas, be completely obedient, do any work, and possibly produce offsprings. The Gulag and its network of concentration camps would not be a necessity for the hybrids. Chimpanzees and humans have differences in chromosomal binding patterns and the number of chromosomes, but the hybrid progeny that would be produced by cross-species breeding would be infertile, would not be able to produce offspring itself. Now, obviously, Professor Ivanov and the Soviet socialist motherland were interested in another result of crossbreeding, referred to as hybrid vigor or heterososis. Heterososis levels have a propensity to be higher as a result of crossbreeding. The vigor of the hybrids is greater than that of paternal lines. I am sure that Stalin and his henchmen would have found another use for the chimeric anthropoids designed by Professor Ivanov. I think today we would call it biological warfare. Now, Professor Ivanov, encouraged by Soviet scientific establishment, decided that an expedition to Africa would help him achieve the necessary results. So he put in a request and received an approval from the Soviet government. He also was given a financial support in the amount of $291,000, a huge amount of money for the impoverished socialist state. The famous biologist believed that he would have no problems inseminating African women with chimpanzee sperm, but he was wrong. Local women refused to crossbreed with apes, regardless of scientific progress. The Russian pillar of this progress would not give up and made an agreement with physicians in a local hospital to conduct the intramural hybridization experiments. The governor of the province did not object to the experiments on the condition that the patients would agree to it, but the women of Guinea categorically refused to be any part of the lurid experiments of the Soviet scientists. Ilya Ivanov was arrested on December 13, 1930 and sentenced to a concentration camp for 5 years. The OGPU, which was the forerunner of the Soviet secret police KGB, commuted his sentence to a 5-year exile in Kazakhstan. And finally, Professor Ivanov was released from prison in 1932. He died a few months later, on March 20th. But you see, our story doesn't really end in 1932. Bernard Heuvelmans was the founder of the science of cryptozoology, a great explorer, a keen researcher, and a writer on the subject. Now, this Belgian zoologist, together with a noted Soviet scientist, published a fascinating book in 1974, and Boris Porshnev, whom I mentioned in my other videos about the so-called snowmen, please view them, I think you'll like them. He was the co-author. Now, according to the Russian researcher Potapov, the book contains an account of a Russian doctor who escaped from the Soviet concentration camps and in 1952 and 1953 met a trusted friend of Heuvelmans. The doctor claimed that he was arrested because he refused to obey the orders from his superiors. He was to conduct artificial insemination of Oriental women by sperm of male gorillas. The experiments were conducted in the medical department of the Gulag, which, as I said, was the Soviet system of forced labor camps. Now, the doctor claimed that a race of ape-men was created. They were extremely strong, covered with fur, tirelessly worked in the salt mines, grew larger than the humans, but could not reproduce. So the question is, did the Soviets create an ape-man in their secret labs, a creature that later escaped and is mistaken in Russia and parts of Eurasia for the snowman or so-called relict hominoid? Russian Dr. Shatalov lives very far from civilization in the town of Nikolskin. The town is in the area of Russia very remote, known as the Vologda Oblast, region. Now, the doctor is a keen observer of nature, and he catalogued unusual phenomena that he encountered in his travels. He is the only physician in the area and often visited the backwoods, where he found villages populated by only 2 or 3 families. Once he received an emergency call. On his way to the patient, Shatalov rode for 40 minutes in an ambulance along a highway. Then he and his driver, they walked for 2 hours to get to the sick man's village. As they approached the village, they saw an abandoned boarded houses. Shatalov entered one of the courtyard and he encountered a completely naked humanoid creature. It was winter and the temperature outside was 4 degrees below zero. The creature was about 4.5 feet tall. Its skin was dark and its face and body were covered with hair. Shatalov was only 25 yards from the creature. He was amazed to see that the creature had very well developed human muscles, but its legs were thin. Now, the beast exhibited no signs of hostility, and it pronounced inarticulate sounds. Its speech did not sound human, nor was it similar to animal growls. Now, finally, the creature ran away through the snow and hid in one of the abandoned dwellings. Shatalov was still a physician who had a duty to his patients. He and the driver kept on searching the village and finally located the sick man, whom they managed to carry to the ambulance. The man was hospitalized, but he did survive. The physician spoke to him later, and the patient was not surprised that Shatalov actually saw this strange creature and was very nonchalant about the doctor's tale. Leshia, or wood goblins of Russian folklore, quite often visit our God-forsaken area, he told him. They cause neither harm nor good. So who knows what kind of creature the doctor saw? Was it a mutant or a victim of some sinister biogenetic experiment? There may be more stories about strange creatures that exist in the backwoods of Russia. Did they escape from some top secret laboratory when the Soviet Union was falling apart? Were they set free to roam the countryside, the forests, or the steppes of Russia? Only more research will tell us, more information that comes out. We know that experiments similar to Ivanov's may become prevalent in today's world, and that in China and other countries there are people who are interested in this. For example, it was the British novelist, screenwriter and director Stephen Gallagher who revealed an interesting bit of information during his address given at the Wellcome Institute Symposium on the topic of "Do Artists Demonize the New Genetics?" This was back in 1995. He heard about a doctor in Shenyang, northeast China, who claimed to have achieved success with the artificial insemination, human sperm to female chimpanzee, only to have the 3-month fetus destroyed by the Red Guards, who came in and smashed up his laboratory. I learned that scientists in China have created embryonic chimeras, hybrid embryos that contain human and rabbit DNA. But that was a long time ago. News were coming out not that long ago from China Now we're talking about 2018, about somewhat similar experiments. Back in September of 2001, there was a report published in Beijing Youth Daily, and it stated that Professor Sheng Shigu in the Experimental Animal Center of Sun Yat-sen University transferred a skin cell nucleus from a 7-year-old boy into a rabbit's denucleated egg and created an embryo. The aim of his research, according to the paper, was to use cloning to develop cures for such illnesses as diabetes and Parkinson's disease. Apparently, with the growing number of scientists and medical centers engaged in similar experiments in China, such as the Shanghai Second Medical University, there is also growing debate about ethics of cross-species reprogramming. And it's not only China, of course. By the way, Italy. This was a long time ago, I would say 32 years ago, when a very interesting article was published in the Houston Chronicle. It was headlined, "A New Breed of Half-Ape Slave Thought Possible." The story was a reprint of a story by somebody from Chicago Tribune about Brunetto Chiarelli, Dean of Anthropology at the Florence University, who said that he had knowledge of a secret experiment in which a chimpanzee egg was exposed to human sperm, with the result that an apparently viable embryo was created. The experiment was interrupted at the embryo stage because of ethical considerations. Scientific information is numerous but reserved. Maybe at the end of the year we'll have an idea of what has been achieved. This was purportedly said by Brunetto Chiarelli. Apparently the cell proceeded to divide. It was the beginning of a routine development process that could potentially have resulted in human-chimpanzee hybrid. Very interesting, because a technique for genetic manipulation of animals involves embryo manipulation using cells as carriers of the novel genetic information. I'm not sure what happened with the Florence University. Maybe somebody else will find out. My expertise is in Russia and Soviet and Russian experiments. And speaking about that and Italy, I need to tell you something else. There's another fascinating document in the declassified Soviet archives. According to the same researcher, Potapov, it confirmed that the Russian surgeon and noted endocrinologist Sergei Voronov lived in Grimaldi, which rises out of the sea, so to say, in the first half of the last century, around 1920, and indeed conducted experiments on great apes. He lived in a special facility, a center he established, and which was known as the Simian Castle. The surgeon animal preserve could contain 100 animals at a time. The scientist was searching for a formula to enable him to slow down the process of aging. He also conducted experiments to increase male virility. Research organ transplantation. Voronov published a book about sexual cells transplantation from apes to humans. Ventimiglia is a small Italian town on the Ligurian Sea and the Italian Riviera, near the French border. In nearby Grimaldi, there are grottos in which prehistoric remains have been found. And this is the area that allegedly has strange creatures which have been sighted in 1990s. Such creatures resembled a crossbreed of a primitive man and a gorilla, naked, 2 meters tall, had long hair, human heads, and large hypnotic eyes and wrinkled skin. Did Sergei Voronov create chimeric creatures that could reproduce and whose descendants wander in the wilderness around the Italian Riviera? There is really not much information about this very enigmatic Russian surgeon. Did he know Professor Ivanov and his research? Another explanation for the presence of the creatures in the forests of the Italian Riviera could be that Voronov was able to slow down the aging process of his hybrids. Some Italian sources mention that the Russian scientists tried to graft bodies of animals on the human ones. But I found another mystery connected to the Russian surgeon. Hidden below the village of Grimaldi, there are caves of Balzi Rossi. Their name comes from the rugged morphology of the local area and the reddish color of rocks. The complex of the caverns, named Balzi Rossi, contains one that is called Grota Voronov. The complex has an enormous prehistoric importance. Archaeological discoveries confirm that the Balzi Rossi held traces of a long series of occupations. The caves were inhabited first by the Neanderthals over 35,000 years ago, during the Middle Paleolithic period, and later by a succession of cultures. Between 1883 and 1895, 15 small and unusual figurines were discovered at the Balzi Rossi. In most cases, the figurines are miniature sculptures of the well-rounded female nudes made from ivory, antler of soft stone, and sometimes even clay, which was later fired. Some figurines carry explicit portrayal of various sexual attributes. One of the figurines is a bicephalous, two-headed Venus, dated between 28,000 and 22,000 years ago. The reason why Voronov's name would be connected with the site of the European Middle and Upper Paleolithic period and the Neanderthals still remains a mystery. I don't know what it has to do with his experiments, but somebody, I'm sure, will find out. Now, we know that experiments such as Ivanov has done will continue in the world, whether we want to or not, because there is not enough oversight, international oversight. Nowadays, the use of genetic engineering raises a number of concerns. And by far the greatest public concern is over the mixing of human and animal genes. After all, both cells fusion and recombinant DNA techniques allow species barriers to be readily overcome. Human beings are changing our world at an ever-increasing pace. New crops appear almost daily. It is certain that we will be using genetic manipulation to change life forms themselves in the coming years. And we should be more concerned about manipulation of animals than of vegetation or of microorganisms. Animals can be grown from chimeric embryos. Embryos that are made by mixing cells derived from genetically different sources. So there is a threshold of cross-species research that we must never be able to step over. Because if we do, we're going to walk into a minefield. We must not create situations where humans make life or death decisions without reference to God. We must be cautious not to create interspecies chimeras that would be able to replace or destroy the Homo sapiens or the humankind. Thank you.